Joelle Chan is an assistant professor at the University of Maryland's College of Information Studies and also the assistant director of the Human-Computer Interaction Lab. Previously, he was a postdoctoral fellow and project scientist at the Human-Computer Interaction Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And he also received his PhD in cognitive psychology at the University of Pittsburgh. His research investigates systems that support creative knowledge work, such as scientific discovery and innovative design, which he will talk about today. His research has received funding from the National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval. Oh, you cannot hear me. Can other people hear me?
I can.
Okay. So I'm afraid to say this may be okay, so most people can hear me, so I will go ahead and continue. So yes, Joelle has received his funding from, in addition to a National Science Foundation, the Office of Naval Research, but also the Institute for Museum and Library Sciences, Adobe Research, and Protocol Labs. And he's also received Best Paper Awards from the ASME Conference on Design Theory and Methodology, the Journal of Design Studies, and the ACM SIG KDD Conference on Knowledge Discovery and Data Mining. And I'm very pleased to introduce him and also to hear his interdisciplinary knowledge synthesis talk. So take it away.
All right. Thanks, Susanna. For those of you who don't know, Susanna and I were in the same lab in University of Pittsburgh. It's pretty special to continue to work together. I'm so excited. Everybody is here. I've got a lot to share with you. I'm just going to dive right in with a story. Oops, I hit the wrong key. So this is a story about the origins of research. I already gave you some previews. So I'm going to read it out to you. This is a researcher talking about how in the second year in the PhD program, they found a manuscript form of a masterful survey of literature on health, education, labor markets, and household behavior in development economics, and found that the questions were super important, but the answers were very unsatisfactory, very explicit about limitations. And this really opened up the field for this student. And they felt they just had to work my way through the review, identify important questions, and productively apply the methods that I learned in labor economics to improve the answer. I gave away the reason why I'm telling you this story. This is a Nobel Prize origin story. This is the 2019 joint winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics, Esther Duflo, responding to people asking her, how do we find the right questions? And one of the answers is to have access to a synthesis, right? This handbook chapter was super helpful. It was this masterful survey, surfaced how the questions were super important, which ones were not well answered, and just really opened up the field for her. All credit to Esther Duflo for doing the work, but also credit for collaboration with the people who were able to synthesize and give her a leg up. So this Strauss handbook chapter is an example of a synthesis, which we can define as the act of unifying intellectual parts into a coherent intellectual whole. Particularly when you have a higher degree of conceptual innovation that clarifies and resolves rather than obscures inconsistencies and tensions in the literature, results in a progressive problem shift, often satisfies formal criteria for good theories. We can see the mapping to what Esther was talking about here. Other examples of synthesis, other than lit reviews, you can think about like technological road mapping, mapping out the space of constraints, why a problem is hard. That's really powerful for synthesis. A kind of list of almost like a meta-analysis that can be super useful for informing policy. This is an example of something that came out of UMD START, synthesizing the literature on violent extremist organizations with a clear sense of the level of empirical support, as well as the applicability and so on. Been really useful. So synthesis is awesome. right? Without effective synthesis, we risk wasting our time on questions, projects, designs that are trivial. We really knew the answer. Impossible. Here be dragons, or misframed. You didn't know about X, so you went down dead ends and more. This is an example of why synthesis is necessary. Alan Newell, one of the important early researchers in cognitive science, warned us that we can't play 20 questions with nature and win. And many people ignored him. And so in, I think this was like, yeah, this 2017, this research area on brain training research, they tried to play 20 questions with nature, and they're like, well, it didn't work. 100 years, and we still don't really understand it. So synthesis is super important, especially across disciplines. You know, the grand challenges of today, human health, understanding food, energy, water nexus, exploring universe, climate change. These aren't neatly boxed into a single discipline. You got to converge, you got to merge, you got to synthesize ideas, approaches, technologies across widely diverse fields of knowledge. One concrete example of this that we're all familiar with right now is how do we deal with COVID? And what's the role of masks? Turns out you can't really do good RCTs, randomized controlled trials. For something like this, you have to synthesize. You have to consider first principles, transmission properties, biophysical characterizations, observational data, partially informative RCTs. You got to synthesize to be able to respond to this. Unfortunately, synthesis is pretty hard. There's one particular variety of systematic review, synthesis called systematic reviews that we have a good data on because people are really interested in how to do it better. And it takes a long time. It takes a long time. And people often don't update their reviews, even when they're out of date because they're so painful. And so this gives us like a data points, like I think it's a lower bound on the cost of synthesis because a lot of times you don't get to address this single relationship as you do in systematic reviews. You have to integrate, like in the COVID example, across a bunch of different types of questions, types of evidence, and so on. And it's not getting easier. Every day, with every year, the body of knowledge grows bigger and bigger. And you know, if we don't do anything to it, we don't synthesize, we have to climb the whole mountain. So what do we do about this? How can we accelerate scientific discovery by lowering barriers to synthesis? Just to get you a second to imagine, what if every community of scientists, innovator, and policymaker had access to synthesis for their problems? A Strauss handbook chapter for everyone, not just the elite prestigious institutions where you can, you know, talk to people that are just down the hall for you, or if you get lucky, right? What would the pace of discovery and innovation be like? What intractable problems might become more tractable? What would your work be like? Today, I'd like to address this question by talking about discourse graphs. I'm going to talk about the promise of discourse graphs for accelerating synthesis, the problem of discourse graph, the authorship bottleneck, and spend most of my time describing this possible future of scholar-powered contributions as a sustainable authorship model for discourse graphs. Okay, so first, the promise of discourse graphs. What are discourse graphs? They are graphs where the nodes are discourse moves like questions, claims, and evidence. So here's an example question. Are bans an effective way to mitigate antisocial behavior in online forums? Claims, various statements about relevant to the question, like banning as a strategy cannot scale, banning is an effective response, and you have sort of informed relationships, support relationships between different claims. If you think about this as an argument map, you're getting pretty close to the core idea. One key addition for discourse graphs that I think is really important is the addition of the evidence node type, where you don't just have claims that people have, they believe things about the world, but we can have particular statements that come from a methodology. So often they're results from experiments, from observations, and so on, from research. So they're graph structures where nodes are discourse moves and edges are discourse relations. And they're grounded in a rich literature. So I'm not proposing this model. There's a pretty rich history of information models on this, starting from 2000, the Skull-Onto model, micro publications in 2012, CPO from 2016, and there's a lot more that I'm not showing here. So people have thought about this very carefully. How do we actually structure our scholarly communication infrastructure to facilitate synthesis? I want to give you some intuition about why you should care about discourse graphs, right? So 3 reasons. Unit of analysis actually matches what you want to know when you're doing synthesis. It enables nuanced reasoning about the context of systems of opposing claims, especially, and it's really important for synthesizing. And it can provide a grounded bridge to more complex compositions like knowledge graphs. So on the first point, matching your actual information needs. If you think about, reflect for a second on what you actually want to know when you're searching for literature and navigating the literature. You actually care about ideas, claims, arguments, theories, findings, and discourse relation, lines of evidence, lines of opposition, right? Replication, contradiction. Instead, we have iTunes or Spotify for papers. We have documents, we have metadata, we have article types as the main organizational principle in most of our infrastructure. For example, right, for the question of bans and hate speech, if you, this is a pretty typical query. What do we see here? You see documents, you see metadata about documents, the year, right? There's nothing there here that allows us to filter by the things we actually care about. Where are the theories, evidence, problems, and solutions? We got to click through, screen through this, make sure that it's actually telling us what we want to, what we're asking for. Same thing with, no knock on these systems, right? They provide a lot of value, especially if you already know what you're looking for. But again, this is pretty standard across most tools. Why does this matter? Here's a graph of the breakdown of tasks and how much time each task takes for a systematic review. Okay, the text is too small for you to read, but you can see these this part is like administration time, planning time, protocol development. This is searching, this is screening, and this is data extraction, and then you do synthesis. Okay. This part is essentially, where are the claims and evidence I care about? And this part is essentially, what are the claims and evidence to synthesize? I got to extract the actual claims and evidence. One way to think about it is that more than half of the work is actually just fighting the system. It's overhead from fighting the infrastructure's unit of analysis. This sentiment actually was at this workshop on automating parts of systematic reviews. And there was a sentiment about like, why are we doing this? Why are we slapping a Band-Aid on top of a broken scholarly communication infrastructure? It just doesn't do what we want to do. Similarly, from an individual level too, right? We've got studies of how people read, and this checks out also. Depending on what you're trying to do, you're usually interested in a very specific part of a paper, right? You're interested in the findings or the methodology or the hypothesis, right? So discourse graphs are a better match for what you actually want to know. They also enable nuanced reasoning about the context of systems of opposing claims. Again, this is the key addition of the distinction between claims and evidence, right? If you have disagreements about claims and no evidence to think through, what do you default to? Volume of citations, maybe, reputation, but you don't have any ability to really get into the diamond and devil of the details, right? With vaccination transmission effects, right? Does the viral load matter? Epidemiological studies, household transmission, right? All these details matter. How are you testing? Where is the thing happening? Which strain was studied with kids in COVID? How do you have the cutoff of age? It turns out many studies treat anybody less than 18 as kids, and it turns out that there's pretty big differences between 0 to 5-year-olds versus teenagers, right? Diversity in teams, how are you measuring it? Disparity, spread, distance, right? You see this in a lot of discourse on health-related research, where there's a lot of really good work on animal models that just get stripped out in terms of context, and people argue about whether this particular diet is bad for you or whatever, based on a ignoring of the context of the evidence that supports those claims. So if you have the claims, you have the evidence, you can actually go down into the evidence level and try to figure out claims that synthesize or figure out where the actual argumentation is. In terms of empirical theoretical grounding, we see this in terms of scholars constantly rereading, doing literature review. This fits our models of sense-making requiring iterative loops of schemas and data, and also in computer-supported cooperative work, the important role of context for reuse. Lastly, this might be a bit more speculative, but we can think about discourse graphs as potentially providing a more grounded bridge to more complex compositions like knowledge graphs, which are super useful. You can do modeling, you can do simulations. There's a lot of insight here. But there's a big gap in the middle. Like, how do you get from here to here, especially when you think about uncertainty and change and contention? So I think there's a role for discourse graphs in bridging. You get a nice balance of expressivity and coverage, and you also get granular provenance and uncertainty. Especially if you think about each statement as essentially a subgraph of nodes and edges in a knowledge graph. And if you map that to the empirical uncertainty, the provenance in the discourse graph, you can essentially play with different competing models of the world depending on evidence and depending on uncertainty, and you can update it over time. So that's why we should care about discourse graphs. It's promising. I'm going to quickly tell you about the problem of discourse graphs. Okay. Essentially, I think the situation we have is we've done a really good job of building out the technical standards and infrastructures. Like I said, this is a long history of thinking about discourse graphs. We've got a bunch of platforms, a bunch of standards, but they're still mostly empty. And this is a quote from Kuhn. In the middle of the picture, there's an ocean of nano publications in the vision. At the moment, this is no more than a puddle. This has been the case for a while. We've tried different models. So specialized curator models are one very common way of going about it. We'll train people, we'll pay them to do this as a job, as a separate thing that they're doing. This is tricky because it's hard to sustain. It's not tied to any intrinsic activity, so you have to fund it. You have to maintain this separate infrastructure. So there's this mark to cure effort that was recently shuttered due to sustainability concerns, annotating the literature on NGLY1 deficiency for treatments. Similarly, you have sites like ROHub and nanopublication servers that have very, very few active users. On the flip side, text mining alone is super cheap, but we still have a lot of accuracy and transparency challenges. Extractive summaries of research papers is really hard. We're looking at accuracies in the 15 to 25% range compared to, say, 60% for human. And size doesn't really improve things for large language models, at least. As they get larger, there's evidence that they actually get less truthful. So I don't think they can save us yet. So what do you do? So let me sketch a vision for you first, and then we'll dive into how we're going about it. Right? There's this idea of scholar power contributions that I'm really interested in exploring. Right? And the basic idea is, in addition to thinking about specialized curator models or text mining, you have the ability to empower scholars to contribute discourse graphs by doing their usual practices. The inspiration for this is some work I did during my postdoc on this model of integrated organic crowdsourcing is what we called it, where if you imagine like a large-scale brainstorming task, we have each individual person has their own whiteboard, and it's useful to have a map of the overall design space so we can coordinate. rather than requiring everybody to do tedious semantic judgments, we actually take advantage of the fact that people naturally cluster their ideas on a digital whiteboard, and we can apply some computational analysis on that to estimate an overall idea map in a win-win, right? So integrate usually tedious semantic judgment work into this intrinsically motivating activity for the common good. This is the pattern that I'm interested in, right? Can we integrate scholar-powered contributions of discourse graphs into individual collaborative synthesis practices? Again, this is a compelling HCI and others problem for sure. One opportunity when we think about it is the opportunity of like this significant untapped creative exhaust. We're doing this already, right? We read lots of papers. Between all of us, we read lots and lots of papers at roughly the same scale actually of the entire literature. We can quibble the details, but you know, the number of people involved in research is quite high. And although the literature is growing, it's not growing that fast compared to what people are actually reading every year. There is a problem that we'll explore from the get-go of, you may intuit correctly that a lot of your reading practices and note-taking and synthesis practices are quite local, personal, and contextual. Whereas we need something a little bit more general, interoperable, or standardized in order to have infrastructure for synthesis. So one question is it sociotechnically possible to integrate authoring of shareable discourse graphs into scholarly practices and workflows? And that's what we're going to explore in the rest of this talk. And we're going to use a research through design kind of approach to think about structuring our exploration. So very quickly, talk about research through design. It's essentially doing design with a intention more on generating new knowledge rather than focusing only on making an artifact that works really well. So this looks like doing design work with a very reflective manner, doing field studies, getting users' reactions, documenting everything with an eye towards what novel perspectives are coming out here, how do we learn about specific theories, what new artifacts can actually sensitize community, broaden the space for design action. There's a kind of prominent research approach in HCI. Just to visualize, right? If you have like engineering knowledge, anthropology, behavioral science, you're doing design work in the middle, you can feed back technical opportunities, unanticipated effects, theory model gaps, and new empirical data as ways of getting design, new knowledge out of the act of doing design. There's a particular flavor of this called field participatory design flavor, our research design that that structures that we have been approaching this. And there's kind of two rough parts that I've done. One is designing an artifact, an experimental extension to our hypertext book that does integrate discourse graph authoring, and reflections on a field deployment, approximately 12 months and counting amongst about 100 to 300 users. So let me show you the artifact first and talk through the design of it. This is going to be a live demo. And okay, I think, can we thumbs up if you can see the screen? If you can see the, good, excellent. All right, so very quickly, if you're not familiar with what I'm showing you, this software is not one that I built, but something that I'm extending into. It's kind of like a personal wiki. So rather than each page being linkable, as in Wikipedia, every block and bullet is a uniquely addressable linkable thing. Like this link to the parent bullet. What is this software? Or it's linked to a focal question page, right? This is how it's organized. All you need to know is like, you know, this is how it works because, and it's useful for me because this gives me a leg up in terms of recognizing structure that might be useful to share. Okay, so let's do the walkthrough here. How might we actually integrate discourse graph authoring into a regular workflow? So let's walk through it. So if you have a question, like how susceptible are young children to COVID-19? usually the first thing you do is you grab a bunch of sources, right? You have a bunch of readings, right? They may be organized in some particular way. And then you read and take notes on them, right? So for example, this is one of the papers in here, right? You may have information about the citation, about who authors it, and so on. And then you might have some notes, right? This probably doesn't look so different from what you might have seen elsewhere, right? You have like a section summarizing what is this paper trying to do, what are the methods, you can put in some screenshots and so on. And then you may summarize what the results and contributions are. Here, the discourse graph workflow could be, if you want to remember and use a particular result from this paper, you can highlight the thing and hit this key and say, I'm going to turn this into evidence. I actually did this already. So it's got information in here already that's been moved over. But you can see, because each of these things is a page, I can put in whatever information I like. I can put in the summary, I can put in a screenshot of the key figure, I can reference, key bits about the methods. So it's all in one place when I look at it. Okay. Testing regime, we don't know. Okay. So that's creating notes. That's what it looks like. You highlight the text and then you say, turn this into a claim note or an evidence note or question note. What about drawing edges between nodes? So going back to here, right? So we got a section for sources, and you might have a section where you're outlining your understanding. And rather than just referencing citations, you can actually reference claims that are emerging and evidence that you've collected, right, from each of these sources. And so you can see this outline structure here, right? We have this claim, children are equally susceptible. And I've written here, the following is the case for this claim. And then here I've put in a bunch of results here, right? And each of these, like I said, has information in it that I put in, right? The notes about what the result actually is. So what does this do? If we click into, say, let's see, this one, where is it? This one. Right, same as before, we've got, the information in here, we've got the grounding context. What we add though is discourse context. So we know that this piece of evidence informs this question that we're in, and it supports a particular claim about children being less likely to contract COVID given equivalent exposure. How do we know that? Because we said so, right? Using the outline. We didn't have to do any separate work. We just arranged it in a way that made sense to us. And there's a pattern that the extension can recognize to say, okay, this evidence supports this claim. And this goes both ways. If you're going to go into this claim, we can see also its discourse context. Turns out there's a bunch of other evidences that support this claim, and it does inform this question as well. So the graph is computationally real. And just to give you a flavor of why that is, we have a grammar that we can configure and say, I care about these kinds of things. I care about questions, claims, evidence, sources. And there's a pattern here, for example. Oops, something went wrong here. How about this one? Okay, there you go. So this one says, if a page looks like this, if it starts with CLM and there's a bunch of content in it, then I'm going to recognize that it's a claim, like this one, and do things with it. Similarly, we can define relation patterns, right? So, for example, we can say, if I write like this, if I reference a claim page, I have a supported by keyword, and I reference an evidence page, then I want you to recognize that this evidence has a supporting relationship with this claim. Okay, that's what it looks like under the hood. Okay, this allows us to do things like, you can export the graph, into a Neo4j, into Markdown, into JSON. We can actually export it. I'm gonna drop the link to it in the chat here for the export of my notebook, if you want to trawl around. And more immediately, you have intrinsic benefits that we're trying to design. For example, if you have each evidence as an actual unit, as opposed to just a note inside a source, you can have properties of the evidence that you might want to do when you're synthesizing. For example, if you're thinking about evidence with respect to susceptibility, you probably want to know about the location where the study was done. You probably want to know about testing. You may say, well, I don't trust results because they might be biased against a particular population because they're less likely to get tested, for example. And so I might be especially interested in the ones that are exhaustive, right? Look at these exhaustive studies, right? If none of them are exhaustive, then I might be more skeptical, right? How does this work, right? You can go inside, because it's a unit by itself, you can add metadata for the evidence, right? Under the methods details, you can say testing regime as an attribute is exhaustive, locations in Singapore, example. People are kind of do this actually already in spreadsheets. In fact, I did something like this for my dissertation, and it's not usable anymore because I lost all the context of the details. So I have to essentially just trust myself that I did it well, because you can't do it in a spreadsheet. Another thing that you can do is, if you're writing an outline, we have a feature that allows you to sort of see inline information about the discourse context of any discourse node that we recognize. So, for example, you can see this one has, you can't see it, 3 discourse relations. I think I set it up so that it only counts the amount of support from evidence, right? So you can kind of see this like talk back, right? This claim I've thought through a lot more in terms of reading, or maybe has like more support. This one has quite a bit of support, and so I can't just dismiss it out of hand. Whereas this one, I don't really know yet in my own thinking. There's 0 discourse relations. So in this way, you can sort of like provide a benefit of if you're carefully thinking through different claims and arguments that you're making, we can use the discourse graph to get a sense of strengths and weaknesses in your own argument. Okay. So let me go back to the talk, just to highlight the key design hypotheses. One is this idea of incremental formalization, which has been a long-standing bottleneck for integrating structure into creative knowledge work. Essentially, if you force people to only enter things in a particular structured format from the get-go, they essentially can't really do any kind of creative work because things evolve over time. The structure emerges as they develop. And so you really want to have ways to have people add structure whenever it makes sense, as opposed to requiring it from the get-go. And you want to have a way to do informal things as a mix of formal things. So the way we do this is we enable you to essentially just post hoc add structure as annotation when you're ready and need it. And rather than requiring you to essentially, enter a form about relationships between discourse nodes, we try to recognize the relationships using relation patterns so that edge creation becomes the same as writing and outlining, as opposed to doing kind of metadata work. So we can bridge immediately useful nodes with implicit discourse structure into a reusable, shareable, explicit discourse graph. Another key design hypothesis is trying to provide immediate intrinsic benefits beyond just giving people the means to do discourse graphing. So we provide ways to actually benefit from having a discourse graph that's computationally real. You can query the graph, you can explore high signal relationships between your nodes, and you can sort of have talkback as you're writing. From a technical standpoint, in terms of opportunities and requirements to feed back to engineering, we have this like simple convention for note writing, which we developed in conversation with the theory and models, as well as our observations of scholars' note-taking behaviors and practices. We have a substrate of a hypertext notebook that has technical facilities that we can then hook into to have a configurable parser so we can translate conventions and notes into a formal discourse graph. In this case, we actually have, if you're curious, it's a data log. Each relation is a data log query pattern over the atomic graph database because that's how it works under the hood in Rome. So key insight from this design phase, I think, is a proof of concept. With these ingredients, it is technically possible to write close to prose and create a shareable discourse graph as a byproduct. But we're not just satisfied with having a proof of concept. In research to design, we want to actually deploy and have it live in the world and learn from it. And so the second part, we did a field deployment, still ongoing in hypertext and research communities. We tell you quickly about it. A bunch of different contexts, actually, because it's super distributed. So some of the sites include a Discord community of approximately 800 academic Rome users. There's a large distributed Twitter, YouTube community of practice around hypertext tools for thought. Been engaging with this community since early 2020. And I think some of my friends are in the chat here. And partnerships with instructors of some note-taking courses for academics and some experimental journal clubs. And in terms of data, we've had somewhere between 100 and 300 users since October 2021. I don't have precise numbers because we don't have kind of granular logs for privacy reasons. But we do have a sense of like downloads of the extension. We've got participant observation with field notes, interviews and conversations with field notes, discussions with users in one-on-ones on chat, in the Discord, and responding to user requests for different features and usage surveys and logs. So I'll be kind of speaking from these data sources today to give a sense of like some key insights. So before we dive into what we learned, I'll just give you some snapshots to give a flavor of usage. I'm using this very heavily in my own lab. So this is a theory paper that I'm writing that draws from claims and evidences that I'm kind of pulling from the literature to give me like a structured way to think through the effects of examples on creative work. We've actually, as a proof of concept of shareability, you can go explore it. I already have the link in the chat. Go poke around in the lab's discourse graph. This is in the Obsidian tool. Somebody mentioned Obsidian, right? It is compatible. You can export, and the graph structure is preserved through relationships described in the text. So that's what it looks like in my graph. There's another library science research team that's using it to kind of do a theory-derived, literature-derived scale for measuring aspects of information overload. We have a medical imaging PhD student using it. We have a criminology PhD student using it, just to give a flavor of what it looks like. Using it in Spanish, I think, not English. A cell biology lab's using this to synthesize experimental theoretical literature to guide computational modeling and simulations for theory building. You can see here the questions to address in this project. We have relationships to evidence, claims, and conclusions and results. More on that later, right? We have an argument that's being built out to kind of think through what experiments to run. Note that we have different note types now. We have conclusions, we have results. We have an international lawyer who wrote a research monograph in a shorter publication using the tool to structure his thinking about the themes and claims and arguments for this particular question. Again, note the extension of the grammar. We have conclusions added as opposed to just claims and evidence, although we still have claims. We have, right, so we can see authorship as well as a different note type, and we have different relations like substantiates, made by, related to. We have a science-based venture capital firm that's also using it to try to identify opportunity areas in relation to the frontiers of what's known about what is possible from a science perspective. So they kind of map out different constraints and solutions for various things like, increasing planetary thriving, reversing global heating, data movements, high energy, so cost efficiency for data storage. Again, note the extension of the grammar, right? We still have evidence, but we also have conclusions and requirements and so on. You can see here, we still have relationships between, say, constraints, which are kind of like claims, right? It's not possible to X, and then we have evidence that's associated with it that you can explore, keep it provenanced. This is what it looks like. Okay, so we don't have time to get into all the insights, and analysis is still ongoing, but I'll just highlight two things that have surprised me, which is why we did the field study. One is extending and personalizing the grammar was both possible and super crucial for adoption. And the second thing that surprised me was immediate intrinsic benefits did not need to be flashy. Let me get into what that means. So in terms of the personalizing the grammar, we saw lots of changes to grammar, as you saw in the snapshots, new nodes, relations, relation patterns. Although many were finer distinctions on like claims as conclusions and hypotheses, for example, or additions on top of a core question claim evidence structure. To give you a flavor of this, here are 4 discourse graphs that were exported and shared with me from the users. And you can see the core question claim evidence was used across the different graphs, but you have a lot of other things that were added, right? You've got experiments, we got results, we got hypotheses. These are for like ongoing work. We've got theory, we've got methods, we've got patterns, we've got issues, conclusions, and so on. In terms of edges, you also have issue for, source for, used in, and so on, in addition to the informed supports and opposes. You get a flavor also of the level of usage within each of these graphs. There was lots of extensive focus on user discussions on extending and personalizing the grammar. In fact, the editor for the grammar that I showed you earlier was initially just for debugging for the design team. We made many UX refinements to the interface to support users' needs for personalizing the grammar, making changes, learning from other people's conventions and so on. So that's this stuff right here. I asked them, each of these features, did you use it? Did you never use it? Is it core part of your workflow? And you can see here, discourse grammar editing is like pretty important. So thinking about this as like discourse graph is a boundary object. We have this kind of weak structure in common use, questions, claims, and evidence, and then the ability to do strong structuring in local use to add nodes, relations, personalized names, finer distinctions. And this makes me more hopeful that discourse graphs can act as a bridge between the local, personal, and the shared global. It's flexible enough. We have a good history of research in CSCW and information science on boundary objects as a way to coordinate between social worlds. So this makes me happy. In terms of immediate intrinsic benefits, don't need to be flashy. Most participants reported value primarily from fostering more careful and creative thinking patterns, which echoes previous work actually on issue-based information systems, for example. You can see here a lot of the flashier intrinsic benefits that I showed you, like structured querying, weren't super important, right? All people wanted to do was make nodes, make relationships, and explore them to think carefully about it. So a couple of quotes to give a flavor of this, right? Once I understood how to use it, I was immediately attracted as a way of adding structure to parts of my graph that are focused on the collection and the synthesis of my research. It's helped me apply a metadata language to the links in my graph so I can see patterns and relationships between different nodes to kind of cut the signal out from the noise. The cell biologist talks about wanting to wrangle his thoughts and notes about the field and using the extension to more systematically inventory and reuse take-homes from reading papers. A bit less rereading and re-annotating than there used to be. So that's what we learned. Let's zoom back up to the larger vision, this kind of idea of a building block for a new infrastructure beyond iTunes for papers. The emerging pattern that I see is that we can actually start by just facilitating individual and collaborative synthesis, maybe go into collaborative and organizational synthesis, as we saw some of the field study snapshots were actually from teams. including my own, and think about discourse graphs as a supplement to organizational memory. And then when scaling up, we can look at, think about things like, peer-to-peer, decentralized protocols that prioritize decentralization and federation over squashing everything into a single universal graph is how I'm thinking about it. This is to be done, right? The first job was to figure out, can we actually get critical mass of things that we then want to try to figure out how to stitch together. So that's next. The general strategy is going to be to kind of grow this new infrastructure rather than trying to impose from the top down. This is sort of in keeping with the insights from studies of infrastructure in social science. Okay. Deploy a vocabulary of growing, fostering, or encouraging in the evolutionary sense, as opposed to going top down. All right, so a couple of short notes about what's next. Expanding discourse graphs from and to everywhere, right? It's not just Rome. We want it to be in any tool that you want to use. We already have independent porting implementation across, I think, 8 other tools or platforms that I know of. And can think about then, if we have all these tools, what might a discourse graph protocol look like? How do we avoid a one standard problem? I don't have the answer yet, but it's something I want to think about. My instinct is that we can start with sort of peering first and then see what comes up. I don't want to start with like a very opinionated single standard for everybody just yet, but I'm open to seeing what comes up. Good problem to have to solve. In terms of formality and machine readability, right? In some areas like bioinformatics, medical research, we have ontologies and the ability to sort of do more granular modeling with knowledge graphs, as I mentioned. I do think that you do have this minimal formality for cross-boundary communication, but you can actually integrate more formality into a discourse graph. Like I said, each statement is essentially like a subgraph of nodes and edges, and we have a controlled vocabulary of entities and relationships. You can simply integrate that into the discourse graph, the statement structure. There's precedent for this already in terms of technical standards. You can integrate it with Sparkle, other APIs, and so on. Last thing I'll say is a shout out to my other colleagues and others who are in the world of question answering and search and NLP. I think there is a role for AI-assisted authoring workflows. I hear there's a lot from users. We don't want automation. We want support for sort of streamlining the processes of essentially foraging for bits of information from the research papers and texts to construct our claims and evidence. So there's a lot of precedence from this in systematic reviews, semi-automation, data extraction that we can learn from. One example of an attempt to generalize this beyond randomized controlled trials only is an illicit system that uses tuned large language models for custom question answering. You can ask questions about, what was the intervention? How many participants were there? A lot of these might vary by the particular synthesis task that you have. I'm interested in seeing how this goes. I think this is a promising UI direction, at least. There are also possible connections to multi-hop question answering, argument mining, and overall, we should be guided by principles of mixed initiative systems and human-centered AI. All right. That is it in terms of what I want to say. Just to put a summary up here, right? Synthesis is necessary but hard because we got the wrong unit of analysis. Discourse graphs can help, but we lack sustainable means of authoring. And based on what we've been doing so far, I think it is possible to integrate discourse graph authoring into individual collaborative synthesis work to sustainably grow new synthesis infrastructures. Thanks to my core team and collaborators, generous support from iSchool and Protocol Labs. If you want to learn more, I'm writing up a preprint that should be ready this semester, but for now you can go read this essay. And if you're interested in playing around with the extension and you're willing to try Rome, documentation is here. All right, that I'll take any questions you have.
Thank you, Joel. We do have a Q&A. We actually have one from about halfway through the talk. And why don't you go ahead and start with that one, and other folks, as you have questions, feel free to put in the Q&A or in the chat.
All right. Yi, curious about knowledge transfer, sharing of using extensive note-taking process as using your own research. In your experience, what is experience like to communicate your synthesis insights with others? That's a good question, right? So I think the question is about if you're using a tool like Roam that has very powerful conventions and features, but you may use it in a very idiosyncratic way. How do you actually share those insights with others? I think it's still an unsolved question. There's the technical side of like, how do I actually just literally share content? My hope is that, think about the discourse graph as a way to make this easier, right? Rather than saying, here's all my notes, you can say, let me gather a bunch of claims that might be useful for you to look at, or here are some key bits of evidence that I thought about when we discussed, this question, and have that as a common language, not just in our words, but also in our data structures. I'm hopeful that that will smooth some of the frictions when it comes to sharing insights with each other. Yeah, especially if we're actually able to translate that into something that's queryable and shareable.
More questions. I have a question.
Yes, Susanna.
Would it be possible to use this framework and technology to map, and you're going to know where this comes from, in order to map ideas as they are raised in conversations over time by science teams?
Yes. Yeah, one of the side projects is actually, so going back to like this vision of discourse graph, all the things. I didn't write in here, but like one of the places we're exploring this is in like Discord and Slack and email, where you have like essentially like starting points of claims and evidence that are raised in ideas in these conversations that you want to sort of capture as you go. There's like fun design ideas around that I'm really interested in. The key trick, I think, is to be able to bridge that to sort of more persistent data structures. We've got some prototypes for a workshop that we're running in a couple of weeks, where we have a bot that, if you react in a particular way to a Discord message, then the bot creates a wiki entry that you can then edit later on. So interested in sort of these bridging practices and working with some other groups that are interested in doing something like this.
I would love to talk with you about this more, but let us go to the other Q&A.
Yeah.
There's an anonymous question. I have all my notes in Wiki right now, Confluence, and would love to try this, but it's a bit intimidating. I'm not sure it's more of a comment than a question, but it's
no, totally get it. So this is again like the vision is that you shouldn't have to switch tools to do discourse graphing. So one of the things that we're trying to do is like try to get together like a spin up like a project or foundation or some kind of like society or community practice where we can sort of share how do we implement, because you don't have to actually, many tools that you can actually do discourse graphing. It's just a convention. And then you might, at some point you could write a software extension to make it shareable. But if you have the convention, you don't have to necessarily switch tools. If you have a wiki, it works really well already in a wiki. So I think that would be my response. Like I wouldn't want you to switch tools. If you're already using Roam and you're gonna try this, that's great. If you're using LogSeq, there's a port happening right now. If you're in Obsidian, you can. There's a couple people that have already done it. If you're in Tinderbox, there's already a forum post that explains how to do it. So we want to have more and more and more of these.
Great. Wayne asks, and it occurred to me to say these out loud because if somebody's looking at the recording, they won't be able to hear, they won't be able to read them. Wayne asks, intrigued by your paid curation example early in the talk, how might this fit the new low overhead peer production model you propose? For example, might a federal funding agency make this a requirement of any large project funding that you both explicitly contribute to commons using a structured format like a discourse.
I really like this idea. I think this makes me think of like requirements for open data and like data sharing, because it's kind of similar in that sense, right? Like it's now best practice to have good data management practices. There's a data management plan. There's requirements for archiving your data. Why not? I think it's a sharp hop skip into thinking about sharing the key insights, particularly if your contributions that you're being funded for are of the flavor of like systematic reviews or theory building or something like that. I'm really interested in exploring that. I really like that idea. I don't know if you would add a darker spin on it. Like, is this going to be something that will be added overhead? I think that's kind of what it sounds like, but I have a positive spin on it. I think hopefully we'll have good support for people to do it before we require it. That would be my goal.
That's great. And there's another question by Wilbert Dimaculangan. I hope that's how your name is pronounced. I'm looking to set up a discourse graph for a lab I'm a part of. Is there some checklist available for doing the setup process?
There is not. Okay. And I think you asked this on Discord, Wilbert. Yeah, let's make it together. There's a couple of labs that are trying to get it set up, and there's a lot of tacit knowledge. Like I think the challenge is to kind of like separate the Rome specific stuff from the discourse graph specific stuff. But yeah, happy to work with you on this. Right now it's like 2 or 3 labs that I know of that are using this, and it's messy. It's especially if people don't use Rome already. So.
Great. Is there one last question somebody would like to ask? And you can, of course, email Joelle.
Yes, please feel free. My DMs on Twitter are also open. That's not another front door.
If we don't have any more questions, it's 1 p.m. And I will say in the OTTRS speaker series, our next one is November 18th. And Riva Schwartz from NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, is going to be speaking about AI, the AI risk framework. So stay tuned for that. And thank you everyone for coming.
Thanks everybody.